My name is Isobel Crane. I am 34 years old. And the thing I want to tell you about is not the money, though the money matters, and I will tell you the exact amount because exact amounts are the only honest way to talk about something like this. What I want to tell you about is the particular texture of being stolen from slowly, over a very long time, by someone you trusted completely, and about the morning I sat in a forensic accountant's office with a printed spreadsheet on my lap and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the person who had stolen from me had been doing it while calling it love. My uncle Desmond died in the spring of my 24th year, on a Tuesday, of a cardiac event that nobody saw coming because he was the kind of man who seemed permanent. He had never married. He had no children. He had a small house on the northern edge of the city that he had bought in his 40s and paid off quietly over the following decade, and which he had, in a will that turned out to be carefully and correctly drafted, left entirely to me. I was named the sole beneficiary. My father was not mentioned. I found this out at 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday in April, sitting across from a solicitor named Graham Birch in an office that smelled of old carpet and very good coffee, while my mother sat beside me with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing.
My father was not at that meeting.
He had said he did not feel it was appropriate for him to attend, given that he was not a party to the will. At the time I found this considerate. I have thought about it since, and I no longer think that is what it was. The property was a two-bedroom rental unit in a neighborhood that had been modest when Desmond bought it and had since become considerably less modest. At the time of his death, it was bringing in tenants reliably, had been maintained to a reasonable standard, and was, according to Graham Birch, worth approximately £410,000 and generating a monthly rental income of around £2,340, give or take, depending on the tenancy agreement in place. I was 24 years old. I had just accepted a 2-year contract position in Amsterdam with an architectural firm that had recruited me directly out of my graduate program. I had never managed a rental property. I had never dealt with tenants or lease agreements or maintenance schedules or any of the administrative reality of being a landlord. My father offered to manage it that same evening, over dinner, at the family home.
He was calm about it.
Practical. He laid out what he described as a simple arrangement. He would handle the tenants, collect the rent, arrange any necessary maintenance, and transfer what remained after his management costs to me on a quarterly basis. He would keep records. He would keep me informed. I was going abroad. I had a career to build. The property would be safe. "You're too young to handle tenants properly," he said, setting down his fork. "And you'll be in Amsterdam. Trust me. Let me take care of it until you're back and settled." My mother nodded across the table. She said he was doing me a favor and that I should be grateful to have someone I could rely on, given how much I had on my plate. I remember looking at the two of them across the dinner table and feeling, genuinely, a wave of relief. I was 24 and frightened by the responsibility, and about to leave the country. The relief felt like the right response. I signed a property management authorization letter on April 19th, 4 days after that dinner. My father had already drafted it. It gave him authority to collect rent, manage tenancy agreements, arrange maintenance, and operate the property's associated bank account on my behalf. I read it in approximately 12 minutes and signed at the bottom. My father kept the original. I flew to Amsterdam on the 24th of April. I was there for 2 years initially, then 3 more after my contract renewed, then another 2 when a different firm offered me a senior role. I had not expected to get so quickly. 7 years in total. I came home for Christmas most years and for a week in the summer when I could manage it, and my father and I spoke on the phone every few weeks. Ordinary conversations about ordinary things, the kind that accumulate over years into a texture that feels like closeness even when the substance is thin. He never once mentioned the property in any detail. When I asked, which I did perhaps 3 or 4 times across those 7 years, he said it was fine, the tenants were fine, there had been a small maintenance issue here or there but nothing significant, and that he would sort out the quarterly transfer once he had reconciled the accounts. I accepted this. I was busy. I trusted him. He was my father. Before I tell you what I found when I finally came home properly in January and started asking questions that I should have asked years earlier, before I tell you about the spreadsheet and the bank statements and the forensic accountant and what the numbers actually said, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now, as you're listening to this? Is it the kind of day where the light looks honest and clear, or the kind where everything feels a little muffled and indistinct? I ask because the day I am about to describe was in early March, and the light that morning was the flat, gray, entirely unsentimental light of a northern winter, and I have not been able to sit under that kind of light since without feeling the exact weight of what I understood that morning. Tell me where you are. I moved back in January of my 34th year. Not to my parents' house. I had rented a flat on the other side of the city, close to a firm where I had taken a senior role, and I had every intention of eventually living in the property that Desmond had left me, once the current tenancy ended, and I had time to assess what needed updating. My father had told me in December, during one of our phone calls, that the current tenants had been there for 3 years and were reliable payers. My first question, when I sat down at my own kitchen table on a wet Saturday afternoon in late January, was simple. I wanted to see the quarterly transfer records. 7 years of quarterly transfers, minus my father's management fee, which he had described in 2017 during one of my visits home as 12% of the collected rent, which I had accepted as reasonable without asking what he was collecting. I sent him a text at 3:22 p.m. on January 28th, asking him to send me a summary of the transfers and the current account balance. I told him I was settling in and wanted to get a clear picture of the property's finances now that I was back. He replied at 6:41 p.m. The reply said he was glad I was home, that he would pull everything together, that the records were in his filing system, and he just needed a bit of time to organize them properly. He said he would have something to me by the following weekend. The following weekend passed. I sent a follow-up on February 7th at 10:15 a.m. He replied that same evening. He had been unwell. He was sorry for the delay. He would have everything sorted within the week. He sounded, in the text, like himself.
Warm.
Unhurried. Not defensive. The week passed. Nothing arrived. On February 17th, at 9:03 a.m., I called him directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. He told me the records were more complicated than he had anticipated to compile. There had been several different tenancies over the years, some maintenance expenses that needed to be accounted for properly, and he wanted to make sure everything was presented clearly before he sent it. He said he was being thorough for my sake. He said he would have it to me by the end of February without fail. The end of February passed. I want to be precise about what I felt during this period, because I think it matters. I did not feel suspicious, exactly. What I felt was a low, persistent unease, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but that makes you check your phone more than usual and lie awake slightly longer than normal and replay conversations you thought were finished. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself he was elderly, he was 67, and records from 7 years ago might genuinely take time to compile. I told myself that a man who had managed my property for 7 years out of kindness deserved the benefit of my patience. I told myself these things until March 3rd when I picked up the phone and called a forensic accountant. Her name was Patricia Vane. She had been recommended to me by a colleague at work who had used her during a business partnership dispute 18 months prior. I called Patricia's office at 9:47 a.m. on March 3rd and spoke to her directly for 22 minutes. I told her I owned a rental property that had been managed by a family member for 7 years, that I had requested financial records and received nothing, and that I wanted an independent audit of whatever could be recovered. She said she would need access to the property's associated bank account, any tenancy agreements she could obtain, and whatever correspondence I had about the arrangement. She said she would begin with a land registry check and work outward from there. Her hourly rate was £340. I told her to begin. What Patricia Vane found, over the following 3 weeks, working methodically through bank records that she obtained via a formal subject access request I had authorized, through land registry documents, through tenancy agreements she recovered from the property management file that my father had never provided to me but which she located through the letting agent my father had used without my knowledge, was this. Over 7 years, from April of my 24th year to January of my 34th, the property had generated a total rental income of £341,260. During that time, £0 had been transferred to me. Not reduced by management fees, not delayed, Not offset against maintenance expenses, zero. Nothing. Not once. The bank account associated with the property, the account my father had been authorized to operate on my behalf, had been emptied in regular withdrawals, averaging once every 6 to 8 weeks, directly into my father's personal current account. The withdrawals were made across the full 7 years. The most recent was dated January 14th, 10 days before I had texted him asking for records. Patricia delivered this information to me in her office on March 24th at 11:15 a.m. She sat across from me with the printed summary on the table between us, and she spoke clearly and without drama, the way people who deal in numbers speak when the numbers are sufficiently dramatic on their own. She told me that the figure was £341,260, that her documentation was complete, and that she would recommend I speak to a solicitor as soon as possible. I looked at the number on the printed page for a while. I had known, by the time I walked into that office, that something was wrong. I had known it since mid-February in the particular wordless way that you know things you are not yet ready to know. But knowing something abstractly and seeing it printed on a page with dates and account numbers and a 7-year timeline are two entirely different experiences. I said thank you. I asked Patricia how long it had taken her to compile this. She said 16.5 hours of billable time, plus the subject access process. I told her to invoice me. Then I picked up my coat and walked out into the flat gray March morning and stood on the pavement outside her office for approximately 4 minutes, not quite able to make myself walk to the car yet. Something inside me tightened in a way that did not feel like grief, and did not feel like rage, and did not feel entirely like either thing. It felt like a door closing. Not slamming, closing. The soft, final click of a door that has been swinging open for a very long time and has at last found its frame. I got into the car. I drove home. I sat in the car in my own parking space for 9 minutes before going inside. The building was quiet. I made tea. I did not call my father. I did not call my mother. I sat at the kitchen table with Patricia's summary in front of me and opened my laptop and began searching for civil litigation solicitors who specialized in breach of fiduciary duty. I need to stop here and give you the backstory because what happened across those 7 years did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of a family dynamic that I had been navigating my entire adult life, and I think you need to understand what that dynamic looked like before you can understand why it took me 7 years to ask the right questions. My father is a capable man. He is organized, confident, and has always understood money in the efficient, unsentimental way of someone who grew up without enough of it and spent his adult life making sure that would not be true again. He built a small property business in his 40s, nothing large, 3 or 4 units at the height of it, and he managed them with the kind of meticulous attention that I had always, growing up, interpreted as principled professionalism. I admired it, actually. It was partly why I had said yes to his offer without much deliberation. He knew what managing a property involved. I did not. The logic felt sound. What I did not fully understand, until I was much older and much further away, was that my father's relationship to money and to control were not separate things. They were the same thing. He managed the properties he owned with meticulous attention because they were his, and controlling what was his was how he experienced security. He had, over the years, also made financial decisions for my mother without consulting her, not dramatically, not cruelly, but consistently, in the way that someone who believes their judgment is simply better than everyone around them makes decisions. My mother had learned, somewhere along the way, to defer to this, and she had never questioned it in front of me that I could remember. In October 2018, during one of my visits home, I had asked my father directly, over dinner with my mother present, whether he could give me a ballpark figure for how the property was performing. I was 28 at that point, nearly 5 years into living abroad, and I had begun to feel slightly embarrassed that I could not answer basic questions about my own asset when colleagues asked. He set down his glass. He looked at me for a moment with a particular expression I knew well, not unkind, but slightly patient, the expression of a man explaining something to someone who should already understand it. The property breaks even most years once you factor in maintenance and my time, he said. You've had some good periods and some expensive ones. I'll get you a proper summary at Christmas. Let's not do this over dinner. My mother said that it was lovely that I had the property and that I shouldn't worry about the details when he was handling everything so well. I did not ask again at Christmas.
I do not know precisely why.
I think I had absorbed over many years the message that asking in detail about money was somehow impolite, that it implied distrust, and that implying distrust of my father was a particular kind of ingratitude that I had been trained since childhood to avoid. I accepted the deferral and flew back to Amsterdam on January 4th, 2019, and did not raise the subject substantively again for 4 years. In March 2022, I raised it again during a phone call. He said the property had had a difficult year, a tenant who had left early, some unexpected boiler work that had cost nearly £8,000, and that he was hoping the next tenancy would stabilize things. He sounded tired and slightly burdened by it, in a way that made me feel, absurdly, as though I should thank him for his trouble. I said I appreciated everything he was doing. He said, of course, it was no trouble. That's what family was for.
I think about that phone call sometimes.
About the precise way he used the word family, deployed like a door that locks from the outside. In July 2022, while I was home for a week in the summer, I asked if I could see the property. I wanted to walk through it. My father said the tenants were private people who did not like unannounced visits, and that it would be better to wait until they renewed or left. He said he would arrange a proper visit in the autumn. The autumn visit never materialized. I did not push for it. I have spent some time since March 24th thinking about why I did not push. I think the honest answer is that I trusted the performance of trustworthiness more than I examined the substance of it. My father is convincing in the way that people who have spent decades operating from authority are convincing, not through charm exactly, but through a kind of steady, unhurried certainty that makes you feel as though doubting them is a failing in you rather than a reasonable response to incomplete information. I had been inside that gravity field since birth. It takes a long time to feel its pull from the outside. I found my solicitor on March 28th. Her name is Adila Osei-Mensah, and she has practiced civil litigation for 19 years with a particular focus on breach of trust and fiduciary duty claims. I had identified her firm through 2 independent recommendations, one from Patricia Vane, one from a colleague whose family had used the firm for an estate dispute, and I had spent the 4 days between March 24th and March 28th doing nothing dramatic. I had gone to work. I had made dinner. I had walked to the corner shop twice for things I did not especially need. I had called no one in my family. I met with Adila on April 1st, a Wednesday at 2 p.m. I brought Patricia's full audit report, 41 pages, indexed, and the original property management authorization letter that I had located in my own files from my move, which I had, by some combination of habit and mild administrative anxiety, kept in a folder of important documents since I had first signed it in April of my 24th year. Adila read through the executive summary of the audit while I sat in the chair across from her and looked at the framed print on the wall behind her desk, which was a photograph of a landscape that could have been Scotland or Ireland or any windswept place that looked like it had endured something. She read for 11 minutes, without speaking. Then she looked up. "The authorization letter gives him authority to collect and manage on your behalf," she said. "It does not give him authority to retain the proceeds for himself. 7 years of collected rent with zero transfer to the account holder is not management, it's conversion. And Patricia's audit establishes the amount to within what I would expect a court to consider reliable. This is a strong civil claim, Isobel. Breach of fiduciary duty, potentially unjust enrichment. I want to file a letter before action and see how he responds." She drafted the letter before action over the following 8 days. I reviewed it on April 9th at 10:30 a.m. It was precise and formal and contained, in its 3rd paragraph, the full figure, £341,260, alongside Patricia Vane's name and the audit reference number. Adila sent it by recorded post and by email on April 9th at 3:47 p.m., addressed to my father at his home address. He received it on April 10th. I know this because the recorded delivery was signed for at 9:23 a.m. and Adila received an email read receipt for the electronic copy at 9:51 a.m. I did not contact him. I went to work. I had a project review at 11 a.m. that morning and a client call at 3:30 p.m., and I attended both and did them well. By the time I arrived home at 6:15 p.m., I had 7 missed calls from my father, 4 from my mother, and 2 from my younger brother, Daniel, who had clearly been told something and was calling with the alarmed energy of someone who has been handed a crisis he does not yet understand. By the morning of April 7th, which Adila had identified as the response deadline in the letter before action, the missed calls had reached 31. I know this because I wrote the number in the small notebook I keep beside my bed for no particular reason except that I have always found it easier to process numbers when they are written down rather than only held in my head. 31 calls. Across 3 days. From 4 different family numbers. My father's voicemail, left on April 7th at 7:44 a.m., the morning the deadline fell, was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. I know the length because I played it twice and timed it the second time. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the accounting was more complicated than the audit suggested because there had been expenses, significant expenses over the years, maintenance and management time, and a period when the property had been vacant and he had covered costs from his own funds. He said Patricia Vane's report was incomplete because she had not had access to his personal records. He said he had always intended to sit down and do a proper reconciliation. He said he was hurt. He said family did not do things like this to each other. He said my Uncle Desmond would not have wanted this. I listened to it the second time with a pen in my hand, noting the structure. There was not a single sentence in 4 minutes and 17 seconds that said, I transferred the money to myself without your knowledge or consent, and I am sorry. What there was, instead, was the careful architecture of a man who had been caught and was now building very quickly a version of events in which he had not been. I forwarded the voicemail to Adila at 8:19 a.m. She replied at 9:02 a.m. Received. Noted. He is not engaged with the claims substantively. We proceed. My mother called at 11:37 a.m. that same day. I answered because I had decided I would answer her calls if not his.
She cried.
She said she had not known, and I want to be careful here because I believe her partially in the way that I believe someone who has spent 40 years not asking questions can genuinely say they did not know the answers. She said my father had told her the property was barely breaking even, that it cost more than it returned, and that he had managed it at a personal loss for years out of care for me. She said she did not understand what the report was saying. She said, please could I just come and talk to them before it went any further. I told her gently that everything needed to go through Adila at this point. I told her I was not doing this to hurt anyone. I told her I loved her. Then I said goodbye and sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the phone face up in front of me and watched the screen go dark. Something about that call, the specific sound of my mother's voice, confused and genuinely distressed in a way I did not doubt, was the hardest moment of all of this. Not the audit. Not the voicemail. That call. Because what it told me was that my father had not only taken the money, he had also managed my mother's understanding of the situation as carefully as he had managed the account, kept her, too, inside a version of events that served him. She was not his accomplice. She was another person he had organized around himself. The civil proceedings were filed formally on April 22nd at 10:15 a.m. Adila submitted the particulars of claim with Patricia Vane's full audit report attached as Exhibit A and the original property management authorization letter as Exhibit B. My father engaged his own solicitor, a man named Charles Refford, who wrote to Adila on April 28th with a counterposition that cited, as my father's voicemail had, the existence of substantial management expenses that the audit had failed to account for. Adila's response, delivered on May 6th, invited my father's solicitor to produce records of those expenses with supporting documentation, receipts, invoices, bank statements, within 14 days. The 14 days passed. Partial documentation arrived, receipts for approximately £19,470 in maintenance costs across 7 years, which Patricia reviewed and confirmed as legitimate. Adila wrote back and said we were prepared to accept a deduction for verified expenses and a reasonable management fee, calculated at 12% of collected rent as my father had originally described, but that the remaining sum, which Adila calculated as £279,341, remained unaccounted for. The case did not go to trial. A mediated settlement was reached on September 11th, a Thursday, at 2:30 p.m. in Adila's conference room. My father attended. He looked older than I had expected, or perhaps I was simply seeing him differently, the way you see someone differently once you have had time outside the gravity of them. He did not speak to me directly except once, at the beginning, when he said my name, and I nodded. We spent 4 hours in that room with Adila and Charles Refford, and a mediator named Dr. Francis Holbrook, working through figures. The specific terms of the settlement are subject to a confidentiality agreement, which I will honor. What I will tell you is that the settlement was reached, that it was meaningful, and that I left that conference room at 6:44 p.m. and stood in the car park for a while in the evening air and breathed. It is now the following spring. I am in the property, Desmond's property, my property, which the previous tenants vacated in December and which I spent January and February quietly updating. New flooring in the kitchen. The bathroom retiled. A fresh coat of paint throughout in a color I chose myself, a warm off-white that makes the rooms feel larger than they are. I work from the second bedroom 3 days a week. On clear mornings the light comes in at an angle that I think Desmond would have liked. I do not have a relationship with my father. I am not certain I ever will again, and I have spent enough time with that uncertainty now to know that it does not require an urgent resolution. Some losses are long and gradual and do not announce themselves as losses until much later. Losing the version of my father that I believed in, the capable, principled, trustworthy man who offered to handle my property out of care, began before March 24th. It may have begun before I left for Amsterdam. I only had the language for it once I had the spreadsheet. My mother and I speak. Carefully for now. She is working through something I do not fully understand and cannot fully help with. I try to be patient with that. Daniel has been, to my surprise, the clearest-eyed person in the family about what happened. He called me in May, several weeks after the formal proceedings began, and said simply, "I'm not going to pretend I think Dad was right. I also don't know what to do with any of this. But I wanted you to know I'm not taking his side." That was enough for me. More than enough. The thing I keep returning to, the thought that has settled into something like an aphorism over these months, is this: protection that requires your ignorance is not protection. It is management. And there is a difference between a person who looks after you and a person who keeps you in a position where looking after you remains necessary. I understood this intellectually long before March. I understood it fully only when I saw the numbers. Here is something that may be useful if you ever find yourself in a situation where you hold an asset and someone you trust holds the information about it. Request full financial records in writing, with a deadline, at least once a year. The moment those records are delayed without a clear reason, engage an independent professional. Forensic accountants can recover bank transaction histories going back many years through subject access requests and court-authorized disclosure. The paper trail almost never disappears entirely. Adila told me that in most cases like mine, people wait far longer than they should because the betrayal is coming from someone they love. She said the waiting is understandable. She also said the waiting makes nothing easier. If you were in Isobel's place, if you discovered that your father had collected £341,000 in rent from property that belonged to you over 7 years and had transferred zero of it to your account, would you have pursued the civil claim to its conclusion? Or would you have accepted whatever he could return quietly and kept it within the family? I know what I chose. I also know that it was the hardest thing I have done, not because the legal process was complicated, Adila made it manageable, but because every step of it required me to hold two true things at once: that my father is someone I once loved completely, and that what he did was not a mistake or a misunderstanding or an accounting error. It was a decision, made once and then made again, every 6 to 8 weeks for 7 years. Some things cannot be explained into something smaller than what they are. That is one of them.